The comics medium is known for being innately sexual and implicitly violent. Put those things together and you have the potential for comics to explore sexual violence in a meaningful way. Of course, even more often than that, you have the potential for the medium to commodify sexual violence in a way that is deeply problematic. Today we're talking about both, and about the complex negotiations that occur on the subject when different authors see things differently. So in today's class, we're going to look at Avengers number 200 and Avengers Annual number 10, written 1 year apart by very different authors. And we're going to use this as a way to look specifically at the concept of fridging, which I'll define momentarily, how it connects to MacLeod's accomplice effect, such as the gutter, and how it speaks to sort of representations of sexual violence in comics in general. Now, in keeping with that last point, we do have a content warning here. We're going to be talking about sexual violence. I'll have some links at the end of the presentation as well for community outreach. So for today's layout, I wanted to do something that wasn't an action scene. I mean, obviously those are so central to the superhero, but we've done a few of them. So here's something that's kind of a quieter moment. So this is after Carol's had her big cathartic speech with the Avengers. So what you see in the top row is a 3-panel sequence in which you get Carol, then a shot of the Avengers, then back to Carol. So it's dialogic, right? It's you talk, then we talk, then you talk, then we talk. But one of the things that you're going to note is that it's a scene about them sort of understanding each other. So you can see them getting closer to Carol. So the first one is a medium shot, and then we come to the Avengers as like a group shot, a wide shot, and then back to Carol, and it's a close-up. So that gives you a sense that, again, they have achieved a greater emotional understanding of Carol. They've come closer to her visually as well as emotionally. And the next shot in the middle is this big wide shot of the Avengers on the plane in contemplation. They're thinking about what she said and all that kind of stuff. To keep a sense of that trajectory, you see the ship heading to the right in the bottom row. And then that trajectory will continue in the very last panel, which, I mean, there's a clear straight line, but it's like one cityscape almost. The idea that it's like moving through that space. And then if you look at the way that the panel in the middle is framed, see how it comes out just a little bit? Like it doesn't line up with the other two panels. It's a little bit taller and a little bit longer on the bottom. That's called an inset panel. The idea is to simulate like a cutout in a medical drawing where you have like a picture of a dog and then you have a big blown up picture of the heart as if it's come out of that. So the idea is that you got the shot of the ship traveling and then you have Wanda and the Vision inside that ship as a cutout, again creating a sort of spatial sense as we move along. This is what's happening on the interior, let's say. That's probably all I need to cover on this one. So MacLeod chapter 3 talks about the gutter, which we very briefly spoke about in our first lecture. This is the idea of the space between panels where the comic comes alive, according to MacLeod, the very heart of the comics. What makes the medium what it is, what makes it unique. Now we talk about this kind of thing a lot in media studies in general. It actually has very different terms for the exact same thing. So one is active versus passive media, which means active media is media that requires you to do a little bit more, to think more, to fill in blanks and that kind of thing, where passive media requires nothing and you just sit there and absorb. MacLeod points this out, and other scholars have argued this as well, that cinema is the most passive media because you're just literally staring at a beam of light and you're not moving. But many film scholars will tell you that's not really fair because there's actually a lot happening in terms of your conscious brain while you're staring at that beam of light. You're still doing things when watching cinema. But compared to a text, like a novel, for example, where you have to like imagine all the characters, the theory is that you're working harder there. Comics for MacLeod is in between. So again, active versus passive media. It's also called hot versus cold media in the theories of Marshall McLuhan and others, and occasionally open text versus closed text. I think Umberto Eco is in on that one as well. It kind of just means the same thing. Texts that require a lot of effort versus texts that don't require any effort whatsoever. We'll actually see a fourth theory on the subject once we get into our video game lecture toward the end of term. So, accomplice effect of the form. So what happens when you have to fill in this gutter space according to MacLeod? Well, two things. The first is co-authorship. which means you are writing the comic as you're reading it. You are drawing the pictures in your head the same way the illustrator draws the pictures in their head to fill in the space that isn't the gutter. So as a result of that, you get this sense of almost like ownership and certainly agency when reading a comic book that you don't get when watching a movie, according to McLeod. But at the same time, the author is free to prompt you visually. So if the author wants a character to look a certain way, they can draw them. Whereas a character in a novel, you have to spend a lot of time describing them, and even then you're not going to get a very good picture of them because description is terrible for representing visual phenomenon. We know this pretty effectively. So it's involving, which leads to the next point, narrative immersion, which is just the idea that because you are filling in the blanks, your brain is really deep into this world and participating in it to a degree that exceeds other media forms. It sucks you in. This is often described in text as well, as something that text does. And again, the implication here is that more passive media like film don't do that. And again, I don't think that's fully fair, but I will leave it to your individual film studies, research, and scholarship to figure out. So that's basically McLeod Chapter 3. Obviously, it's complicated and nuanced, so read it, but that's really all I need to say about it for now, other than how it connects to what we're doing today. So what we're looking at today is how a certain representation in comics can take on a political perspective that can be potentially damaging, or the inverse of that. Now, if McLeod's theory is true, that the reader is co-authoring and involved to a greater degree, then that does suggest that comics have the potential to affect the extent to which we internalize the concepts that we see on a comic book page. Comics are a very persuasive medium as a result of this accomplice effect that McLeod talks about and this immersion effect. So when we're talking about, say, sexual violence, that means that comics might have the potential to normalize things like that based on what's depicted in comics, which is obviously problematic, and then, again, might have the potential to revise certain perspectives on sexual violence and thus have like a powerful, politically soapbox kind of thing going for them. Again, just based on the nature of the form. Okay, so we'll pick this up as we go along. The next concept I want to throw at you, and I think it's the last one for now. I might be lying to both you and myself in terms of my ability to not throw random theories at you. Let's talk about women in refrigerators. Gail Simone, who is a famous female comic scribe, we talked about her very briefly when we were talking about Wonder Woman. She's written Wonder Woman. She's most famous for Birds of Prey. She did a really good run on Birds of Prey that's still being reproduced today. This would be the early 2000s. And then some of her friends comprised a list of female comics characters who were murdered, mutilated, or depowered. It was like a blog thing, just kind of keeping track of the phenomenon. And what they found was a weird kind of discrepancy between how often this is happening to women versus men. And obviously more so towards women. This leads to the term fridging, which refers to hurting or destroying a female character in service of a male character's story. So the template for this is a Green Lantern story in which Green Lantern gets home and his girlfriend is chopped up in the fridge in order to like enrage Green Lantern further, which is okay, cool. Like that's a good way to amp up narrative tension. But as Simone points out, a lot of people liked his girlfriend. She was a good character. And you destroyed that character in service to his character. So there's a sort of subserviency that comes out of that. So anyway, I'll just give you her words. The simple point had always been, if you demolish most of the characters girls like, then girls won't read comics. That's it. These are superheroines who have been either depowered, raped, or cut up and stuck in the refrigerator. I know I missed a bunch. Some have been revived, even improved. Although the question remains as to why they were thrown in the wood chipper in the first place. So again, fridging is destroying a female character somehow. It doesn't have to be death, but you can destroy them by like making them not a superhero anymore in order to advance a male character's narrative. And I mean, as is probably already going through your head, we do this a lot, and not just in comics. So with that in play, let's go to our texts. Start with a little bit of background on Carol Danvers to sort of unify the two pieces. So she's Carol Danvers, that's her actual name. She's known as Ms. Marvel at first, and then in 2014 becomes Captain Marvel. So she gets a rank boost, which is appropriate to the character and what she stands for. She's in background stories as early as 1968. She's not much of a character. She's a Lois Lane type. She doesn't have superpowers. She then gets superpowers by accident. She gets them from the male Captain Marvel, who just has like weird alien strength and flight and stuff. And then in 1977, Marvel Comics decides that they want a feminist superhero. Like this is the mandate. It wasn't the character first, it was the mandate first. We need a feminist superhero. So they decide to cultivate Carol Danvers into this superhero named Ms. Marvel. She's named after Ms. Magazine, which was created by Gloria Steinem, who we talked about in our Wonder Woman lecture, as a kind of alternative to like Cosmopolitan magazine, which at this time it's sort of lost its feminist slant. As I mentioned to you briefly, Stan Lee's devotion to this project was shady at best. And yeah, Ms. Marvel was not a really good character at launch. So a few issues in, they gave her to Chris Claremont. At this point in time, Marvel's strategy for when they couldn't launch a female character was to give it to Chris Claremont to fix. And he did really well. His Ms. Marvel run became kind of cult standing, and is again still republished today. Got a lot of attention and acclaim, but, and you kind of see where I'm going with this, it didn't sell well, so it got canceled. It did give us a lot of cool things, though, including Mystique, the female villain character who's in like all the X-Men movies, played by Jennifer Lawrence. She comes out of Ms. Marvel. Then in Claremont's run, I said it just gets cultivated. Then she goes over to the Avengers for a bit, because that's what Marvel does when they cancel a book. They just send the character to the Avengers, so they can still have it, in the zeitgeist. And Avengers 200 happens, which we'll talk about. Claremont reclaims the character beginning in Avengers Annual number 10. I still don't understand why he is writing an Avengers Annual. That wasn't his thing. He must have forced his hand somehow. And then Carol gets significantly better for a long time and then falls into the hands of other writers. Famously doesn't go great. She's largely defined by being an alcoholic for most of the 2000s, which is yikes. And then in 2014, the character gets revived under Kelly Sue DeConnick, to whom all praise and glory must reside. DeConnick is the one who made this character prominent again. Infinite praise for the stories she was telling, and brought her to the forefront of sales, which is hard to do with the lead female character in comics, and led very, very directly to what you see in the Captain Marvel movie, which does draw from other aspects of Carol's backstory as well, but really particularly DeConnick's. And that's Carol Danvers, still around today, still making comic books. So let's go to Avengers 200. Now, the first thing you need to note is that the writing team is a committee, which is very unusual, but less unusual for like a big event comic, such as issue number 200 of the Avengers. It's Jim Shooter, who's kind of a known misogynist, Bob Layton, David Micheline, and George Perez, who are not that. Perez is known for writing a great run on Wonder Woman and for having a lot of sort of progressive ideas. So some of these people you would expect maybe what happens in this story to come from. Some of them you would very much not. So again, maybe the important thing here is just it's an all-male committee. And yeah. Now, in the build-up to this, Carol gets pregnant over the course of like a few weeks. It comes to full term. So magic baby. We don't know what's up. And then this issue, after she's given birth to her lover and rapist. And yeah, what the hell? On those lines, this was a solid joke on the internet. I thought it was a solid joke on the internet. Where you have Brie Larson, an Academy Award-winning actress who specifically won an Academy Award for The Room, which is a story about the horrific consequences of sexual violence. And there's a picture of her reading Avengers 200 with the caption, "Wait, what?" Which, yeah. Anyway, here's a critical perspective on what happened. Carolyn Coca, who is the author of Superwomen, maybe the best known text on the subject of superwomen in comics. The number of misogynistic tropes in this one issue is quite startling. It indicates that women's minds can be altered and that they enjoy rape, that all pregnancies are cause for joy no matter the circumstances, that women are emotional during pregnancy, but of course will love their children as soon as they see them, that women can come to love a rapist, that romantic love and parental love are the most important thing in the world to women. All of those things. Carol Cooper, writing way earlier, writing at the time this book came out. Coco's writing a few years back. Cooper says, in that issue, an all-male Marvel staff slaughtered Marvel's symbol of modern women, Ms. Marvel. They presented her as a victim of rape who enjoyed the process and even wound up swooning over her rapist and joining him of her, quote, free will. And honestly, they're not wrong. Like, that's there. I'm not sure the male team intended to present it that way. I think, if anything, this is a sin of ignorance. Again, just based on some of the writers who were there. But it's a big sin. This is a rough portrayal of a female character and leans into all manner of feminine stereotypes. Some of them quite damaging. So speaking to that a little bit, the critical issues that come up here. Sexual coercion. He says, like, it's almost a throwaway line. Ms. Marvel goes to visit him, and eventually she comes around to seeing him romantically, and then he says, with a subtle boost from Immortan's machines, she consented, or something to that effect. And why is that there? Like, there's no reason for that to be there. She could just fall in love with him. It wouldn't alter the story in the slightest. But they felt the need to inject this aspect of, like, she's been roofied, sort of science fiction roofied, which is, again, strange to put it in there. We have the element of incest, the idea that he comes into this world through her womb, and she gives birth to him and raises him from a child. Admittedly, that's only like 2 days, but still. And she falls in love with him despite that, maybe even because of that. She says that because you're my child, I feel weirdly closer to you. I want to see where this relationship goes. And why couldn't he have just done like a Terminator thing and come into the world normally? And then we have romanticization, which is like a tonal thing. The story presents this as if it's a romantic story, like they're telling a sweet little fairy tale, and we should all be applauding at the end of it. And the degree to which that reflects abject cluelessness is genuinely horrifying. That you could read this and think, oh, that's sweet, man. That's a fairy tale for the ages. Is bewildering once again. We also have communal acceptance. What I mean by this is Carol is part of a found family in the form of the Avengers, and they're okay with this. Like, Iron Man asks Ms. Marvel, are you sure you know what you're doing? Which I would argue all of them should be asking. The community shouldn't accept Marcus. They should attack him. He's a villain. But they don't. They too see this as positive. And that comes back to our brief discussion of the male gaze. The fact that all these epic heroes that we love and admire see what goes on here and think this is okay. That says to the reader that this is okay. It validates it, thus contributing further to the problem. And then we get very directly to the fridging aspect. This isn't just a story that happens to Carol. This is how Carol departs the Avengers because she was an unpopular character. So she had failed in her own book, and she had failed as an Avenger. She's going into comics limbo. She's not supposed to ever come out. She's on the garbage heap. So the idea that this is how you sort of usher her off the stage is especially tragic, particularly to people who loved this character. And again, she had a cult following. There were people who loved this character. And this is how you write her off the show, so to speak. Really does speak to fridging in kind of a complex way. Okay, so then we come to Avengers Annual number 10, which was written in 1981. It has some notable things going for it that I could briefly mention. It is the first appearance of Rogue, the character many of you know from like the X-Men movies or the animes or stuff like that. Very popular comic book character. She's eventually going to be an X-Man. She starts out here as a villain. It has Michael Golden artwork. Golden is a very famous comics illustrator with not like the largest superhero output. So when you get work from him, it's usually very, very impressive. And he doesn't write too much in the Marvel Universe, draw too much in the Marvel Universe. So really good to see his fantastic art. And like some of the images you see in this book are just spectacular, especially when they're fighting with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So yeah. However, you've got Michael Golden drawing your book. He didn't draw the cover. What the hell? That's like reverse what you're supposed to do. You have your best artist draw the cover, and then you hire the crappy people to do the interiors, and thus selling the book. No, Al Milgram and somebody else did the cover to this, and it's not good. I don't know why I'm editorializing like this, but sometimes I editorialize. Okay. Claremont is writing. Again, I have not been able to track down how he got the assignment on this one. He doesn't write Avengers, but he is writing and sort of taking over and criticizing other writers of the Avengers, which is very strange. Spider-Woman is there for reasons, specifically because Claremont was also writing that character at the time, and he has a weird thing where he can't let go of characters, so he always draws them into other books. So she's there for that reason. She doesn't belong there at all. And the editor-in-chief on this book is, in fact, Jim Shooter. So when he's criticizing Avengers 200 in this book, he's criticizing his boss in a book that his boss is editor of. How he got away with this, I have to assume ludicrous power and infinite confidence. So, strong language from Carol here. There I was, pregnant by an unknown source, running through a 9-month term, literally overnight. Confused, terrified, shaken to the core of my being as a hero, a person, a woman. You took everything Marcus said at face value. You didn't question. You didn't doubt. You simply let me go with a smile and a wave and a bouncy bon voyage. That was your mistake, for which I paid the price. My mistake was trusting you. After a trauma like mine, it's easy to wallow in bitterness and self-pity, but both grief and guilt have to be faced, dealt with, exercised. So what she's doing there is she's expressing trauma, which is something that's not normally there. Normally in comic books, we excise that kind of trauma. It's not something that you drive stories around, and when characters do suffer from trauma, they're over it by the next issue. And that includes sexual violence, even though we know that, no, it does not work that way at all. So this is part of a broader sort of trend of the excision of post-rape trauma in comics and media in general, which doesn't like to talk about that for reasons that are somewhat obvious perhaps, but also far more complex than we might realize. So I wrote an article on this for the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics that I wanted to quote because narcissism. As the ethical humanist Susan Bryson notes, survivors' testimonies must be heard if individual and cultural recovery is to be possible. Bryson suggests that the self as a concept becomes vulnerable post-trauma, and that victims of sexual violence have to rebuild an understanding of who they are and what their place in the world is, possibly from scratch. When applied to comics, this concept of self-reconstruction suggests that narratives that perpetuate the absence of traumatic consequences can potentially hurt reader survivors, while ones that acknowledge the pain, suffering, and validity of the trauma potentially contribute to the reader survivor's healing. By spinning narratives of sexual violence that ignore real-world accounts of long-term trauma, and by choosing fantasy over real-world experiences, the mainstream superhero comic book industry does not seem to recognize or acknowledge survivors' testimonies at all. End quote. So again, it's a thing that is cut out of comics that probably needs to be there for the exact reason of we don't want to take sexual violence at face value. We don't want to take it as an easy thing. We don't want to take it as a simple narrative trope without consequences. And a lot of comics were doing that in the 1970s and maybe doing it still, depending on who you talk to. Hopefully, I would say less and less so, but that might be optimistic. Now, this argument actually goes a step further, to the point that Carol actually calls the Avengers out, but she's not really calling the Avengers out. This is Claremont calling out the writers. He's calling out his coworkers. He's calling out his boss. So my mistake was trusting you. And I already read this part, didn't I? There's more. There has to be more to being heroes than simply defeating villains. You have a role, a purpose far greater than yourselves. You have to set examples, lead the way. You represent what we should be, what we dream of becoming, not what we are. You screwed up, Avengers. That's human. What is also human is the ability to learn from those mistakes, to grow, to mature. If you do that even a little, then perhaps what I went through will have a positive meaning. It's your choice. So yeah, when she says Avengers, she means writers of the Avengers. This is Claremont directly saying that when you are telling these superheroic stories, which are supposed to represent the best of humanity, you have an obligation to do better than what they did in Avengers 200. that Shooter and Perez and Micheline and Leighton failed. And again, it happens. He says you're human, you make mistakes, but you got to do better going forward. So it's a very strange thing to have a comic call out the other writers and editors like this, but that's very clearly what Claremont is doing. And he's been acknowledged and recognized for doing this at a time when, frankly, comics could get away with this kind of casual misogyny pretty readily and not be questioned about it. So having that questioning come not from like a fan or even a critic, but having it come from the best-selling writer of Marvel Comics at the time, that means something, and again is something that the audience is supposed to reflect on as something they're owed by the writers of these particular stories. So again, maybe something powerful and positive coming out of this, or at least that's what Carol/Claremont's hope on the subject was. Okay, so rough material today, obviously. I just wanted to post the UW community resources on sexual violence. You'll find all kinds of 24-hour support and options. There are other options available online as well. If anyone ever finds themselves the victim of sexual violence or knows somebody who is and wants to help. This is a huge problem. It's especially a huge problem on university campuses. Obviously, that's significantly reduced during the pandemic, but we also know the pandemic is having a very negative effect on domestic violence. So again, these resources are here. Feel free to share them widely. Which leads to your discussion questions. How do modern media portrayals of sexual violence compare to what we have in Avengers number 200 and its retcon in Avengers Annual number 10? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't define that. Retcon means retroactive continuity. A retcon is when you change what happened after it happened. So you say, no, Superman didn't die. He went into a coma. It just looked like he died. You've retroactively altered continuity. That's what a retcon is. Do we still see the excision of sexual trauma in media? Is the manner in which sexual violence is represented and commodified different today than it was in the past? Are there any other examples of media specifically checking itself over the representations of sexual violence, such as we see in Avengers Annual number 10? And how do those representations compare? So I want you to try to keep it connected to our text. Don't just say, in the TV show Supernatural, this happens. Compare it to what happens here, just so we have a little bit of connective tissue to what we're working with today. And with that, I will see you on the next lecture to talk about queer superheroes. That should be fun.